my name is Frank Wenske. I'm from the product management of application lifecycle management products at SAP. And one product I'm responsible for is SAP Focused Run. And today's topic is an overview of the different deployment options for the Focused Run system. Let's give a short introduction. If you are going to operate or to deploy a Focused Run system in your landscape or in a customer landscape, this can be done in multiple different ways. I will explain the different scenarios in a minute. But before you can decide on how to deploy a Focused Run system, you have to understand some basic components and some basic concepts for the infrastructure and common components to be used, to not go here or to start in the wrong direction. Focused Run uses some components which are only installed once per managed server. So, for example, the simple diagnostics agent or the host agent, which are also serving multiple other purposes, not only for Focused Run. So the host agent is also famously known for usage as part of software lifecycle management activities. And those components are designed and developed in a way that we can also serve multiple Focused Run systems in parallel. So even if they are only available once per managed host, they can easily connect multiple systems. How this is done and how exactly what exactly you need to consider in the installation, I come back to this then in the second half of the presentation. Then one additional information: Focused Run is a tool for application operation. It is not in scope for infrastructure operation, especially things like deployment of mass operations, mass distribution of software components in the landscape, or even certificate management are not in scope and not functionality which is provided by Focused Run. But those functionalities are helpful if you want to deploy a Focused Run system in your landscape to even further automate or further optimize the installation, or even provide certificate-based authentication and secure communication in a cross use case. The communication between SAP Focused Run and the managed systems is not recommended to be exposed to the public internet. Our recommendation is that you are using always VPN connections to connect the Focused Run system and the managed system if the systems are not running in the same data center or in the same location. The reason for this is quite easy. If you want to use establish the communication via the public internet, this would involve that you have to expose the host to the public internet. So the host and some ports of the host will be accessible from the public internet. And this is always a kind of dangerous scenario, what we would not recommend. That's why we explicitly recommend establish communication cross data centers, cross organizational boundaries. So, for example, between a service provider and the customer, always via a VPN tunnel and not via public networks. And it is mandatory between managed components and Focused Run to establish a bidirectional connectivity and a full DNS hostname resolution. So it's not possible to address systems in your landscape or the hosts in your landscape via the IP addresses. We are always using host names to communicate. We are always using full qualified host names to communicate. And those host names which are resolved by the DNS servers must be then resolvable from the DNS server to an IP address, and they must be reachable in the necessary boundaries. And we are using communication in both directions, from Focused Run to the managed components, and also from the managed components to Focused Run. So it's not enough to have just established a unidirectional connectivity. You always need connectivity in both directions. Sometimes, if there is a direct connectivity not possible, there are some workarounds available to overcome certain limitations. So, for example, same IP address range and so on. Those are the common known tools from network design, like proxy servers or reverse proxy servers, which can be used to make this requirement possible, even if there are technical limitations, which does not allow a direct communication between the two endpoints. Let's start with the simplest scenario, how a Focused Run installation can be deployed in a customer landscape. So we have a Focused Run, which is deployed in the customer own data center and connects only to systems which are operated in the same data center or a neighbor data center, and where all the access and naming resolutions in all directions are possible. So this is the easiest and straightforward scenario, where no special considerations have to be applied. So in such a scenario, Focused Run will work straightforward out of the box. This scenario can also now be a bit extended. For example, the customer decides to deploy some of the systems not in his own data center, but instead in a hyperscaler environment like AWS or Azure. Usually, the systems in this hyperscaler environment are operated in the same way like on-premise systems. So the customer gets hosts in the hyperscaler environment and deploys the software components in this hyperscaler environment on his own. He usually also has the complete root privileges on the hyperscaler systems. So, and the data center, the network in the hyperscaler environment is usually operated in a kind of extended network segment for the normal data center network. So in those cases, we also see in most situations no specific considerations which needs to be in place in case such a scenario happens at a customer. A bit more complex, usually it becomes if you are operating the systems at a service provider side. The biggest change in those scenarios usually is then that the service provider is the only one who has root privileges on the managed components. So certain software components, certain deployment options, you have to align with your service provider. The communication between the customer environment and the service provider is usually established via VPN communication. This VPN communication for the managed components, in most cases, is anyway necessary because not only the customer Focused Run needs to access the managed systems in the service provider environment, also the end user needs to have access. So such a VPN communication is, in the cases we are aware of, already established, even also to ensure that there's an end user, that the end users can access managed components which are operated by a service provider. So it's not a specific or an additional requirement which comes in just by operating the Focused Run system. The only thing is you need to make sure that not only your end users have access to the managed components operated at the service provider, but also one of your deployed server components, the Focused Run system, has access to these managed components. One thing which comes here also then in the game is the first shared component. So in this case, if the managed components are operated by your service provider, the service provider usually takes also responsible for the host agent component, because as said, the host agent is not only used by Focused Run, it's a shared component having different functionalities in the lifecycle of managed systems. and especially from the basis operation of managed systems, they are also used by administrators for managed system, which is then usually the service provider. So at least certain alignments in this scenario are already necessary, while technically usually there's no big hurdle, no big deal, because in a normal environment there's direct access possible. The naming resolution would be also working straightforward, so there would be no specific additional components necessary to overcome here any restriction. A bit more complex it becomes if the service provider also operates a focused run system for his own purposes. So the usual scenario here is the service provider connects managed components operated by himself to his own focused run system to provide service provider functionalities, like, for example, license management, like EWA generation, like system monitoring for the systems in your landscape, which are usually then in the responsibility of the service provider. If he operates the SLA, also the availability management for the managed systems. And this can, of course, be done by a focused run system. And we have seen quite a lot of service providers which are operating one shared focused run system for all the managed systems they are hosting for multiple customers. And the customer on top can also operate his focused run system with different functionalities usually. So a customer would then use this his own focused run system for systems here, not with the same scope like the service provider, but with a different scope more on the application monitoring, so monitoring interfaces, monitoring jobs, and so on. Both systems can be connected to the same managed components. I already explained it. We have some shared components which are then which needs to have some special considerations. And of course, in such a scenario, there are some alignments necessary, which I will explain later on, what kind of alignments you have to consider and where you have regularly to align with your service provider. The scenario can be even a bit more complex if the customer not only decides to have a service provider for the infrastructure and basis operations of some of his managed components, but if he also buys services of an application management provider. So, for example, some certain integration scenarios are outsourced to an application management service provider who is also using a focused run system to provide the services. And besides using here the focused run in the customer environment, some application service providers prefer to use their own focused run environment and connect then also to the same managed components. The scenario is then not that the application management provider will connect to all the managed system at the service provider, but he will connect to some selected systems, which might be deployed at the service provider side, which might be deployed at the managed in the customer environment, and he will connect all those systems to his own focused run system, which is deployed in his own environment. Of course, to establish this scenario, there needs to be some additional VPN connectivities established. This can be a direct VPN connectivity between the AMS provider and the service provider, or in some cases, it's even a tunnel connectivity. So the AMS service provider connects to the customer network, and from the customer network, he's using the VPN connectivity between the customer network and the service provider. But at least it's still the requirement. We need to establish a kind of network access between all the focused run systems and the managed components. A scenario which is relatively new is the so-called Focused Run Private Cloud Edition. The Focused Run Private Cloud Edition as a scenario is something where a service provider provides a focused run system as part of his service portfolio. And he provides the basis operations for this focused run system, but not for his own purposes. He will deploy such a component as a component to be used then from the application perspective from the customer. The advantage of using this private cloud edition usually is that such a private cloud edition comes pre-configured. So the service provider already prepares some infrastructure preparation, some application preparation, so that the focused run system later on can then be easily used by the customer, and he can avoid the necessary basic steps in the initial configuration of the focused run system. For those scenarios, we are going to publish a document in the expert portal, which especially describes what kind of infrastructure preparations can already be provided by the service provider in such scenarios to speed up the setup process at customers. Let's have a deeper look on all the details we have now to clarify if we want to operate multiple focused run systems connected to the same managed systems. Usually, if we have to do this, we have to consider some shared components where an alignment between the customer and the service provider or application service provider is necessary. And there are two things where an alignment is highly recommended from our side, even if we don't see here an issue if the data flow is unaligned. So beside the shared components, there are two scenarios where the focused run system is exchanging data with SAP for providing then also services from SAP side. This is first of all the system data upload for the maintenance planner scenario. Each focused run system by default will upload the landscape data of his own landscape to SAP. And if you have multiple focused run systems connected to the same managed components, this upload will be also done by each of the focused run systems. If it is wanted, you can also disable this service data upload or the system data upload for the complete focused run system or for individual managed components in the landscape management database inside of Focused Run. But there's also no issues expected if multiple Focused Run systems are uploading the same data, because all Focused Run landscape data is acquired in the same infrastructure, in the same data acquisition way. I will explain this in a minute. And we expect that all the system data which is uploaded independently from which focused run system they are coming looks in the end the same. So there's no individual maintenance or manual maintenance needed in between. Therefore, even if multiple focused run systems are uploading this data, we do not expect here any issues. The second scenario is the EWA scenario. So for receiving early watch alerts for your managed components. Also, all focused run systems by default will try to upload the EWA data for productive systems to generate the EWAs. There's a scenario in place at SAP which detects multiple data uploads from multiple focused run systems and processes only one EWA for one managed component each week. So we are automatically detecting if multiple data packages are sent for the same system and only process one EWA. And inside of Focused Run, you can also disable the data sending for certain systems with the EWA application to even avoid the data transfer in such cases. So it is totally enough if one Focused Run system sends the data to SAP, and you will receive the EWA each week in the expected quality. Let's have a closer look on the shared components. We are starting with the simple diagnostics agent, the SAP host agent. Every every host in a managed component environment has an own sub-host agent, and the simple diagnostics agent is in the end just an extension to the sub-host agent. So it's a plugin which is deployed to the sub-host agent, and it's running also once per managed host. But the simple diagnostics agent is multi-host enabled. So this means in the end, if we have multiple focused run systems connected to the same simple diagnostics agent, we store one configuration file per focused run system in the simple diagnostics agent, and the simple diagnostics agent is then also executing all the data collection tasks which he is responsible for separately for each focused run system, and then sends the data to the respective focused run system. So the data is completely isolated on the simple diagnostics agent for all the focused run systems, and then sent. And as you can see here, during the sending process, we can use also then a direct communication. So the simple diagnostics agent sends the data directly to the focused run system in all the cases where we have a direct network communication enabled. But we can also tunnel the connectivity via a reverse proxy. So we are sending the data only to a reverse proxy scenario. And then from the reverse proxy, the data is sent to the focused run. These reverse proxies are usually deployed and are a prerequisite if you are operating multiple customer networks in one focused run system. So in this scenario we see here, for example, the AMS provider is using a shared focused run system for multiple customers. The service provider is using a shared focused run system for multiple customers. And to make sure that this data separation is not only here on the managed component level, but also the focused run system will have this data separation, we are using these reverse proxies to differentiate the data and to separate the data between the different customer segments. As said, it's not it's mainly required for multiple customer networks inside of one focused run system, but it can also help to overcome some network limitations. So, for example, if on your managed system the target URL or the target host name of the focused run system is not directly resolvable, you can use the reverse proxy to overcome this DNS network, this DNS resolution problem. Only the DNS endpoint of the reverse proxy must be resolvable, and only the reverse proxy needs to have a communication to the focused run system. Additionally, to make sure that all the landscape data is transmitted to all the focused run systems, we have to make sure that we have the SLD data providers configured to send data to all focused run systems. There are different SLD data suppliers available, like RZ70 in ABAP, like SLD Rec for HANA and ABAP, for HANA and Java, and like outside discovery for all the host-based data. These different SLD data providers needs to send their data to all connected focused run systems. And not all the SLD data providers are able to have multiple destinations enabled. And as I said already before, it's necessary that all focused run systems have a complete picture of the landscape, or the complete information from the managed component. And to make this happen, we provide with Focused Run an additional component, which is called the SLD Landscape Data Router, the SLDR short set. And this Landscape Data Router is forwarding the data from all the SLD data suppliers to multiple Focused Run systems. So you can configure all your SLD data suppliers to send the data only once to this SLD router, and from there the data is then split and transferred to all the connected Focused Run systems. This SLD data router is not an own component as such. It's just a process which is running as part of the simple diagnostics agent. So the installation effort for operating such an SLDR is very, very low. It's a configuration step, a one-time configuration step, which is done once. You have to provide a port where this SLD data router is listening to. You have to configure the forwarding target, so you have to provide the information where the data has to be sent, whatever is received on the inbound side, and then it is started as part of the simple diagnostics agent. So there's no separate data logistics for this. There's no persistency for this SLD router. It just takes the data which is coming on the inbound port, multiplies the data, and then sends it to each outbound destination. And this SLD data router, of course, will take into consideration also reverse proxy setups as they are sent to the simple diagnostics agent. One additional special component, especially if you have Java systems in your landscape, is the Introscope API Advanced Performance Management Enterprise Manager setup. This also sends data collected from the Java bytecode agent to the Focused Run systems. The configuration is also in those cases automatically deployed from the respective Focused Run system on the APM host to the correct directory. So you don't have to do much of a configuration. But there's one thing you have to consider. The identification of the Focused Run system in the APM Enterprise Manager is done using the SID of the Focused Run system. This is an important point to remember. If you have multiple Focused Run systems, they all should have a different SID. Because if they share the same SID, the configuration file in the APM Enterprise Manager might be overwritten. This is one limitation, one alignment point you have to consider if you want to connect multiple Focused Run systems to the same managed component. What you need to align if you want to operate multiple Focused Run systems, you have to align on a release strategy, especially for the simple diagnostics agent and host agents. Especially who is responsible for doing patching activities on those components. Usually, in our experience, the responsibility is within the infrastructure provider, so within the service provider. In which frequency this is done, and how to establish extraordinary patch sets. So especially with the diagnostics agent, host agent, we try to be downward compatible as much as possible. So even the newest simple diagnostics agent, the newest SAP host agent is able to operate all the supported Focused Run releases which are out in the market. But a new Focused Run system might require a higher version for newer functionality. So some functionality which we require, which we are using to collect data, is deployed as part of the simple diagnostics agent or the SAP host agent. And if the Focused Run system is connected to an SDA or host agent which does not have already this level, this new data collection infrastructure is then not working. So the partner which is the fastest in patching the Focused Run system should then also be defining the patch strategy for the simple diagnostics agent and host agent. And also in those cases, as said, for example, the host agent is also used for other things. You should always carefully review the release notes if there is something which has to be considered specifically in this version. A second step, a second alignment which needs to be handled carefully is the security topic, especially the certificate handling. Who is responsible for creating the certificates? Who will distribute the certificates? which CAs are needed, which root certificates needs to be deployed in the landscape, how to establish trust relationship between sender and client and server, and so on and so forth. So the security handling really needs to be defined between service provider and customer. And last but not least, also responsibilities for operations of the shared components. So who is responsible for operating, for example, a host agent? If a host agent is stopped, who is responsible for restarting it? And if there's an access needed, how to establish the access procedures. So a typical setup example of deploying Focused Run or the Focused Run deployment options. Usually we have a share IP range. So customer and service provider and AMS provider all use their own IP ranges. We have the routing between the IP ranges established via routers, via firewalls, and so on. The IP ranges are whitelisted in the firewalls for the necessary ports. The ports you need to open is the host agent, the SLDR ports, also the reverse proxy ports for the new Focused Run system. And then we have to share the root certificate between both parties, or between all three parties, which wants to connect to the managed components. In some cases, we have to implement some specific considerations for the defining the full qualified host name. As said, we are always reserve the full qualified host name. We know that some customers or some service providers are using here different full qualified host name, whether the resolution is internally from their own administration network or from the customer side. So we are using different DNS domains for the same hosts. This can be accommodated by Focused Run via the use of a body, where the host name mapping can be corrected. Then we need to maintain also the HTTP server settings in the host agent to control access for the simple diagnostics agent, especially to make sure that the customer, for example, is not able to update the simple diagnostics agent version, and only the service provider can do this. And then we need to add a new Focused Run system as an additional outbound connection in this SLD router configuration. And then, of course, don't forget to plan some time for testing. Usually, if this is happening the first time, you see some missing activities, some missing connectivity requirements, and so on. So you should do careful testing before really releasing it into production. Here on in the slides, we also provide you some details on how this can happen, what all you have to follow on the guides and so on. So kindly visit here our expert portal with all the special resources also for this deployment options. And having said that, I'm finished with my presentation today.